Welcome back, explorers, to Whoosh Tales, the home of the greatest kids' adventure stories anywhere on the internet, bringing you a brand new English story for children every single week. This is episode 18, and if you have been following Finn Walker's journey from the very first night the sky cracked open over Stonehaven village, you already understand that we have arrived at a really significant moment in this whole adventure story series. The first chapter of the story is complete. The personal Norwegian pilgrimage is complete. The map is unfolded on the kitchen table. The compass their grandfather built specifically for Caleb is sitting in a small padded velvet slot inside the wooden box, waiting patiently to be picked up. And today, on a fresh, warm summer morning at the cottage in Stonehaven village, Caleb Walker is going to activate that compass for the very first time. And where it points is going to surprise every single member of the family, in the best possible way. They had all been home for 4 days since Norway. The rhythm of the cottage had reorganized itself around the arrival of Margaret Halloran into their lives. Margaret had extended her stay at the small guest house in the village for another week to help the family with the initial planning, and had been coming over every morning at 9 with her large ordered notebook and her sharp pencil and her small worn leather bag. Their mother had come to regard Margaret as something between a very dear old family friend and a long-lost sister, and had already invited her to come and stay in the cottage itself rather than paying for a guest house. Margaret had accepted the invitation politely and had moved her small suitcase over on the second morning, and was now installed in the small, warm attic bedroom that faced the garden. She had made herself immediately useful in the ordinary running of the household. She was very good at washing dishes and even better at making a particular kind of scone their mother had never quite managed to master. And by the third morning it felt as if she had always been there. Old Thomas had begun joining the daily planning sessions on the second day. His involvement had been suggested gently by Margaret on the first morning after Norway. She had known about him for years from their grandfather's careful references and had been quietly hoping to meet him for a long time, and their grandfather had specifically wanted Old Thomas to be included in the mapping work when the time came. Old Thomas and Margaret had taken to each other with the immediate calm affection of two people who had spent their whole lives being competent and reliable in quiet ways, and who recognized the quality in each other instantly. He arrived every morning at 9 with his wooden staff and a small tin of shortbread biscuits from his own pantry, and he sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and their mother and the 3 children and contributed observations about certain locations on the map that Margaret had not been able to fully verify from the archive. They had spent the 4 days going through the map in careful detail. All 37 chambers. The 12 well-known ones. Old Thomas confirmed the current state of some that Margaret had been uncertain about, having heard news of them through his own long, quiet network of contacts over the years. The 8 uncertain ones. The family agreed with Margaret's assessment that visits to those should be attempted only after Caleb had gained more experience. And the 17 unvisited ones, the priority list, the work of the coming decades. Nora had turned the 17 priority locations into a beautifully organized chart in her own notebook, complete with distances from Stonehaven, estimated flight times on Ember, and rough proximity clustering that would let them plan efficient routes. Nora at 14 was becoming, they were all realizing in a way that surprised nobody, an exceptionally good project manager. Their mother had been overheard to say to Margaret privately that Nora was going to have absolutely no trouble getting into any university she cared to apply to when the time came. Ember had participated in the planning in her own way. She had taken to lying on the sunny stones of the garden path, just outside the open kitchen door, every morning at 9, and closing both her golden eyes and listening to the conversation inside the kitchen with the attentiveness of a family member who did not need to say anything to be usefully present. She had developed a particular interest in the small brass compass their grandfather had built for Caleb, which lived in its velvet slot inside the wooden box on the top of the bureau in the front room. On the third afternoon, Nora had found Ember carefully carrying the wooden box out of the front room and into the garden in her mouth, and had understood after a very brief moment of alarm that Ember simply wanted to lie beside it in the sun for a while. The box was returned to the bureau every evening and taken out to the garden every morning with Ember's implicit approval. By the 4th morning, the family had done all the initial planning they could do without actually beginning the work. Margaret had suggested at breakfast that today should probably be the day. Everyone had agreed. Their mother had made an unusually thorough breakfast. Porridge with honey and cream, thick warm bread, a small dish of poached apples, 3 pots of tea, and had then rolled up her sleeves and cleared the kitchen table completely except for the small wooden box, which she placed in the exact center of the table with the same careful respect she would have used for a christening candle. She stood back. She looked at Caleb. "All right, my darling," she said gently. "It is time." Caleb had known this was coming and had prepared himself. He was wearing a clean pale gray jumper that morning, and his hair had been combed by their mother. And he sat down at the kitchen table and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the wooden box for a long, calm moment. Everyone else took their places carefully around him. Their mother at the head of the table, Nora on Caleb's right, Finn on his left, old Thomas across from him, Margaret at the other end of the table from their mother, Ember watching through the open kitchen door from the garden, one golden eye visible. Caleb reached forward and opened the box. He lifted the small brass compass out of its velvet slot with both hands and set it carefully in front of him on the wood of the table. It was more complex up close than it had looked in the box, perhaps twice the diameter of an ordinary pocket compass, its casing beautifully engraved in the same script that had covered the walls of the underground chamber beneath the cottage. Its face had a needle in the center, and around the outside of the needle, 3 smaller dials arranged at even intervals. Margaret had explained the previous afternoon that the 3 smaller dials would show additional information once Caleb activated it. Approximate distance to the nearest chamber, approximate difficulty of access, and approximate urgency based on how faintly or strongly the chamber's small resident was still calling. She had learned the workings of the compass from their grandfather's own notes during the last months before his descent, and she had checked her understanding twice against the journal to be certain. Caleb had studied the notes carefully on the 3rd morning and was reasonably confident he understood the theory. But the compass had never actually been used. Nobody quite knew for certain what would happen when Caleb activated it. He looked at Margaret. "Just place your palms on either side of it," she said gently. "Warm it slowly. Do not push too much light into it too fast. Give it time to wake up. It has been waiting a very long time to meet you." Caleb nodded. He placed his open palms flat on the table on either side of the compass, close enough that his fingertips almost touched the brass casing but not quite. He closed his eyes. He gathered his light in his sternum the way Anya had taught him. He breathed slowly. Then, at a very careful, gentle level of brightness, he released the light outward through his palms and around the compass in a soft, warm amber gold bubble. The compass began to hum. Not audibly. None of the family could hear it, but Caleb clearly could, because his eyes stayed closed and a small, quiet smile touched the corner of his mouth. He continued to hold the gentle amber gold light around the compass. After perhaps 20 seconds, the needle in the center of the compass began to move very slowly. It rotated a full turn once. Then it rotated a second full turn more slowly. Then it hesitated. It quivered slightly. And then, with the particular clean deliberateness of an instrument arriving at its bearing for the first time in its life, it settled. It pointed south. Not directly south. South and very slightly east. The 3 smaller dials came to life a moment after the needle settled. The distance dial showed a reading Margaret and Nora both leaned in to check, approximately 680 kilometers. The access difficulty dial showed a reading in the lower middle of its range, not the easiest chamber, but by no means the hardest. The urgency dial showed a reading that made Margaret nod in quiet approval, moderate. Not desperate, not critical. The chamber's occupant was calling, but was not near the edge of exhaustion. There was time to prepare properly. Caleb slowly dimmed his light and opened his eyes. He looked at the compass. He looked at Margaret. "Where does that point?" he asked. Nora already had the atlas open on her side of the table and was tracing the bearing with a small ruler and a sharp pencil. She looked up after a moment with her eyebrows drawn together slightly in the puzzled way she looked when something did not immediately match her expectations. "London," she said. "It is pointing at London." The kitchen went quiet. "London," said their mother, carefully. "Yes," said Nora. "Somewhere central London." Old Thomas leaned forward and looked at the atlas. Nora angled it toward him. He looked at her carefully drawn line. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, that is not what I would have predicted. But it does make sense in a strange way. London has been a city for 2,000 years and a village for a very long time before that. There are very ancient layers of ground beneath its modern streets. Not everything old in that city has been dug up and cataloged. If a chamber has been quietly waiting there for 3,000 years, it will have been buried under a great deal of history without being noticed. He looked at Caleb. This will not be a chamber like the one in the Arabian Sea. This will be a chamber inside a city. Margaret was already leafing through the journal to the section on urban chambers. There are 3 of them on the priority list, she said as she looked. Their grandfather had suspected London might contain one, and I had noted the possibility here. She showed a page to old Thomas, but we had never been able to confirm it. It appears the compass has confirmed it now. She looked at Caleb. This is actually a very good first chamber for you to visit. It will be closer to home than most of the others. It will not require deep water swimming. It will not require extreme physical altitude. The main challenge will be that it is beneath a modern city, which means we will need to find the chamber's exact location in a way that does not draw attention to the family. They spent the next 3 hours planning. Finn made another pot of tea. Their mother produced more bread and buttered it in a very careful mechanical way that Finn recognized as the way she buttered bread when she was quietly working through a decision. Nora refined the London bearing with progressively more precise measurements. Margaret consulted the journal for indications of what part of central London the chamber was most likely to be under. Old Thomas, in his slow, reflective way, considered the practicalities of arrival. How one might land a crimson dragon within reachable distance of central London without causing an international incident. By 11 o'clock, they had a working plan. The bearing pointed at a spot in central London that Nora, cross-referencing with a detailed street map their mother had produced from a drawer, was able to narrow down to within about 100 meters of a specific major railway station. Margaret's journal notes suggested that this particular station had been built in the middle of the 19th century on top of much older ground. The site had been a small village during medieval times, and Roman ruins had been recorded beneath the area 150 years earlier. Whatever chamber there was almost certainly located below the modern floor level of the station itself, which meant the family was going to need to walk into that station like ordinary travelers, locate the exact spot above the chamber using Caleb's compass, and then find some way to reach the chamber from where they were standing. The dragon problem, as Nora called it, was going to be solved by leaving Ember behind. There was no reasonable way to fly a crimson dragon into central London undetected in the middle of a summer afternoon. Ember was going to have to stay in a hidden meadow they knew of about 40 miles outside London, and Finn and Caleb and Margaret and Nora were going to take the train the rest of the way in. Margaret, old Thomas noted approvingly, had lived in London for parts of her working life and knew the railway system well. She was going to be the family's guide inside the city. Their mother agreed to stay behind at the cottage. Someone needed to be at home, and their mother had never particularly cared for London, and old Thomas would keep her company. They would fly the next morning, take the train in, locate the chamber, do the work, take the train home, fly back to Stonehaven. Simple in outline, complicated in detail, perfectly manageable if approached carefully. They left the following morning. The flight south down the length of Britain was easy and pleasant. Margaret sat behind Caleb with her small leather bag over her shoulder and the compass tucked carefully inside her jacket pocket, and she pointed out landmarks to the boys as they passed: the Lake District, then the Peak District, then the rolling green fields of the Midlands, then finally the outskirts of the enormous metropolitan spread that surrounded London. Ember set them down in the small hidden meadow about 40 miles outside London just before noon, a meadow old Thomas had known about since his own younger traveling years, invisible from any road, sheltered by a ring of tall, old oak trees. Ember settled contentedly into the deep grass, with the small stream running through the meadow to keep her cool. Finn kissed her warm crimson nose, and Caleb pressed his palm against her cheek, and Nora patted her shoulder, and Margaret gave her a small formal bow which Ember appeared to appreciate. And the 4 humans walked out of the meadow along a small hedge-lined path to the country lane beyond, where they waited 15 minutes for the small local bus that ran to the nearest railway station. The train into London took about an hour. Finn sat by the window and watched the countryside give way to the outer suburbs, and then to the denser rows of terraced houses, and then to the great crowded diversity of the inner city. He had been to London twice in his life. Once as a very small child on a visit to a great aunt who had since passed away, and once on a school trip to the Natural History Museum. Both times he had been struck by the same thing that struck him now: the sheer number of people. Millions of them. Walking on pavements, riding in taxis, standing at bus stops, sitting in cafes, reading newspapers on trains. Every one of them going somewhere. Every one of them carrying their own private mourning inside them. Every one of them completely unaware. Finn now understood that a small, warm creature had been quietly calling for help beneath the marble floor of the very railway station they were about to walk into for the past 3,000 years. Caleb was sitting beside him, and Finn realized, watching his brother look out the window at the city, that Caleb had never been to any city larger than Stonehaven before in his entire 11-year life. Caleb was taking London in with the same slow, careful attention he had brought to every new place, noting shapes, noting sounds, noting colors, noting the particular density of human activity. He was not overwhelmed. He was simply present, which was going to be extremely useful in a few hours. They arrived at the railway station just after 2 in the afternoon. Margaret led them off the platform and into the main concourse of the great station with the calm ease of a woman who had walked through it many times. The concourse was enormous. The great arched roof rose in beautiful ironwork above their heads. Hundreds of people were moving in every direction around them. Commuters, tourists, families with luggage, business travelers, small groups of children on outings. The floor of the concourse was polished dark marble worn, slightly smoothed by generations of footsteps. Departure boards clicked and updated on the walls. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked pastry drifted out of small kiosks scattered around the perimeter. Margaret drew them to a slightly quieter corner near the west wall and produced the compass carefully from her jacket pocket. Caleb took it and cradled it gently in his palms and closed his eyes for a moment and warmed it. The needle came to life at once, much more quickly this time. The compass had been activated once now and was ready for repeat use. It settled after a few seconds. It was pointing across the concourse, slightly northeast. Caleb opened his eyes. "Follow," he said quietly. They walked slowly across the busy concourse, with Caleb's palm cupped protectively around the compass so that nobody passing them would notice anything unusual. Nora walked slightly ahead of the boys, opening a gentle path through the crowd the way an experienced older sister does when she is escorting her younger brothers through a busy public place. Margaret walked at the back, keeping an unobtrusive lookout. Finn walked between his brother and Nora with one hand casually on Caleb's shoulder in the way of an older sibling being casually protective in a crowd, but was really allowing him to guide them by the smallest shifts of pressure of the shoulder without needing to look at the compass himself. The bearing led them across the concourse to platform 4. Caleb turned onto the platform. They walked along it toward the far end, past parked trains and small clusters of waiting passengers. About 2/3 of the way down the platform, Caleb slowed. He stopped. He looked at the compass. He looked down at the platform floor. The needle was pointing straight down. He looked up at the others. "Here," he said quietly. The 4 of them stood together in a small, casual cluster in the middle of the platform, pretending to be a family waiting for a train. Nora had produced a folded railway timetable from her bag, which she was pretending to consult, and Margaret was looking at her wristwatch, and Finn had his hand casually on Caleb's shoulder. To any passing observer, they were entirely unremarkable. But directly beneath them, 30 meters straight down through the platform floor and the ancient earth of central London, a small, warm creature was quietly calling for help through the sound of 100,000 daily footsteps. "Now what?" Nora said quietly under her breath. Margaret checked her wristwatch again and then looked at Caleb. "Can you reach it from here?" she asked softly. Caleb considered this for a long, careful moment. He held the compass close to his chest. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them. "Yes," he said. "I think so. The stone above the chamber will act as an amplifier. If I release my light downward through the platform floor at the right frequency, it will travel through the stone and reach the chamber. I do not need to physically go there. I just need to be directly above it." He paused. "It will not be as good as being right beside it, but it will be enough. If I stay here for perhaps 45 minutes and hold a steady flow, the chamber's occupant will receive what it needs." They arranged themselves carefully. Caleb sat down on his backpack against a pillar on the platform, as if he were a slightly tired boy on a family train journey resting his feet. Finn sat down beside him. Nora and Margaret arranged themselves, standing casually nearby, apparently deep in an aunt and niece conversation about railway timetables. Caleb placed his palms flat against the platform floor on either side of him, casually, as if resting them on a cool surface on a warm afternoon. He closed his eyes. He gathered his light, and he began to release it downward through the platform floor at a slow, steady rate. A very quiet, warm, amber gold glow began to emanate faintly from Caleb's palms into the marble. Nobody around them noticed. The passing crowd was too preoccupied with their own trains and their own plans and their own small mid-afternoon distractions. Caleb held the flow steady. Finn watched his brother carefully. Nora and Margaret continued their pretended conversation. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. Trains arrived at other platforms and departed again. Announcements crackled over the station's public address system. Two small children ran past, chasing each other. A pigeon flew in through an opening in the roof and landed on the platform and pecked hopefully at a discarded pastry crumb. And 40 meters below all of that, through 30 meters of ancient stone and packed earth and buried Roman ruins and medieval clay, a small warm creature that had been calling for 3,000 years was slowly being warmed and refilled by the light of a boy sitting quietly on a railway platform above it. After exactly 45 minutes, Caleb opened his eyes. He looked at Finn. "Done," he said quietly. Finn nodded. Caleb dimmed his light. He got up carefully and slung his backpack over his shoulder. Nora appeared beside him casually. Margaret glanced at her wristwatch and said, aloud and cheerfully for the benefit of anyone within earshot, "Well, that was a nice rest. Shall we catch the next train home?" They walked slowly back along the platform and across the concourse and out into the ordinary bright London afternoon. The great city continued its enormous business around them as if nothing had happened. Nobody looked at them. Nobody noticed. And beneath the marble floor of Platform 4, exactly 30 meters down, a small warm creature that had been alone in the dark for 3,000 years was now peacefully asleep with its internal glow bright and steady and strong enough to keep going for another several thousand years without help. Caleb's first chamber on the priority list was done. 16 more to go. They caught the train back out to the countryside, the bus back to the village, the walk down the small lane to the meadow. Ember was waiting patiently with her chin on her folded front paws in the deep grass, one golden eye opening as they came through the gap in the hedge. They flew home in the deep gold of the summer evening. They ate a wonderful supper their mother had prepared. Old Thomas had stayed for supper too, and heard the full account of the day, with the quiet, delighted attention of a man who had spent a long life quietly hoping that certain kinds of things would work out, and was now personally hearing an account of them working out. And that, the lesson at the heart of this kid's adventure story for explorers, is one of the deepest lessons this series has yet offered on the subject of hidden things. Extraordinary things are almost never where you think they are. They're almost never in dramatic remote places. They're almost always right underneath the completely ordinary things you already walk past every single day. A railway platform, a busy pavement, the floor of the shopping center near your house, the corner of a public park, somewhere in your own city or your own town or your own village. Extraordinary things are quietly present, doing their work, hoping you will pay enough attention one day to notice them. Learn to notice them. Learn to pay attention to the ground you walk on, to the buildings you walk past, to the places you take for granted. There is far more happening beneath the surface of your ordinary daily life than any of us usually stop to consider. And when you learn to notice it, your ordinary daily life will become considerably more magical than you ever suspected it was. Hey explorers! If you sat with Finn, Caleb, Nora, and Margaret on Platform 4 of that London railway station this afternoon and quietly helped a small creature that had been calling for 3,000 years, give this video the biggest thumbs up it has ever received, because you have absolutely earned every quiet moment of it. Our comment question today is one of our most delightful. Have you ever discovered that something amazing was hidden in a completely ordinary place near where you live? What was it and how did you find it? Tell us about it in the comments below. Every single response will be read with great appreciation. Subscribe to Whoosh Tales right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single adventure story for kids. because next week word begins to spread beyond the family. Someone Finn has never met sends a message to the cottage asking if the boys might be willing to help with a very unusual problem in the small harbor of a fishing town in Wales. We will see you next week, explorers. Hush. That night at the cottage, after supper, Nora updated the beautifully organized chart in her notebook. She drew a small, careful check mark beside the first entry. London, completed. 16 more entries waited beneath it. Their mother came in and looked over Nora's shoulder and put her hand gently on Nora's back. "My extraordinary girl," their mother said quietly. Nora looked up at her and smiled the small smile she used for compliments from their mother, which was the one place she had never learned to deflect them. Margaret sat by the hearth reading through the journal for tomorrow's discussion. Old Thomas had gone home to sleep. Caleb was in bed, tired in the deep good way after his first proper piece of chamber work. Finn stood at the front door of the cottage and looked out at the dark Highland night for a moment. The stars were extraordinary. The bell tower down in the village was humming faintly. Somewhere far to the south, beneath the marble floor of a busy London railway station, a small creature was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3,000 years. 16 more chambers waited. There was time. There was patience. There was family. There was work. Finn smiled quietly to himself in the doorway and closed it gently and went upstairs to bed.